Painting trees can be very tedious and very frustrating at some points. But I feel if you're persistent and constantly challenge yourself and practice over time, something that's complicated can become a lot more easier to do. And in this video, I am going to show you how I painted the trees in my recent church painting that I finished some time ago. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I'm going to show a demonstration on how I painted this complicated web of branches in the painting I recently finished called Forgotten Church. I'll be honest, at some point I did get frustrated and lost, but I had to keep my cool as I painted each and every branch and leaf. I am going to first show you the reference photo that I used and dissect it for you. After that, the rest of the video will be a time lapse that shows in detail how I painted most of the trees, plus lengthy commentary where I talk about how I did it. Anyway, on to the photos. This is the photo that I used for my painting. The main subject is the church, but there were a lot of trees, and I really did like how they were directional and in a way pointed to the church. As complex as this looks, I like to follow a few simple steps. And the first step is make sure you paint the skeleton of the tree. This here is an idea of what I mean. Your first goal is to lay out bodies of color and get the shapes of the trees and branches, particularly the big ones. After that, it's a lot easier to paint the rest of the trees. Oh yeah, and definitely make sure you get a nice underpainting or drawing for the rest of the objects, but that's a different subject. In this photo here, I will show you up close what I mean about building the skeleton, or should I just call it framework, of the tree, and then later building the branches. Here's the photo again. Here's the main skeletons for these two trees right here. After you lay out the skeleton of the tree, you start painting some of the smaller branches. And after that, it gets easier to do everything else. Think of the bigger branches and the trunk of the tree in a way kind of like a roadmap for painting the rest of the tree. And after that, when you carefully paint every other branch, typically from larger to smaller, it gets easier. It just requires lots of patience and possibly lots of corrections. And after building the framework and skeleton of the trees, the leaves are a lot easier to do. Another important thing I want to mention is the layering of the branches. This is probably one of the more confusing sections of my painting, and if you pay very close attention, there's an order of each branch and tree. For example, this tree is the closest, so it's in front of every other tree, and this one right here is behind. To illustrate that better, this red here shows the tree that's in front, and this blue here shows the tree behind, and the green in the end shows a lot of the branches that are behind every other branch and tree. The point I'm trying to make with this illustration is to tread and paint carefully as you do this network of branches and trees, and try to make certain ones distinguishable. I'll show more of that during the painting process. And if there's one last important thing I want to mention before I show the demonstration, and this is very important to keep in mind when you paint trees, it's that trees are not flat like this sheet of paper. They are a bunch of cylinders connected to each other. Therefore, when you paint them, make sure you give them a sense of volume with a series of lights and darks, soft and hard edges, and detail. Now on to the demonstration. I always start with the underpainting. I used a simple grid to get the composition down, and also I wanted to go for accuracy for this painting. I laid out bodies of color. At first they are very simple. A dark grayish brown is what is representing the trees right now, and a very bright green for the grass, and so on. I am not being very detailed right now. I'm just trying to work out the composition and get everything in the right place. Once I feel confident to move forward, I start painting the trees, but very strategically.
During the underpainting process, I laid out the skeletons of the tree, or should I say framework. Now that I have an idea of where the trees and branches are going to be, I start to paint the sky. As you can see, I'm okay with painting over the branches and parts of the tree because later I'm going to go back into them. But right now I am trying to establish a pale blue background. During this time, I'm also correcting some of the branches as well. One awesome feature of acrylic paint is that it dries quickly, so you can make corrections as you go. And during the whole painting process, I am constantly making corrections, whether it's the trees, the church, or even the grass. But as for the trees and branches, I'm making some thinner, some thicker, and erasing some altogether, and adding a few later on. I am not following the photo 100%, but I'm definitely paying very close attention and in some ways picking and choosing what I like and inventing some of the branches here and there as well. But I am definitely using the photo to get an idea of the lights and darks, and more importantly, to make the branches and trees believable. And in order to make them believable, you have to show that they have volume and mass and occupy a three-dimensional space. And the best way to do that is to pay attention to the sunlight. So before I even start to detail the bark on the tree, I try to establish where the lights and darks will be, including the branches as well. Besides trying to capture the sunlight, I pay attention to the branches that recede more into the distance and the ones that stick out in front closer to the viewing plane. That is why you will notice at one point the two trees to the furthest left are the lightest and have less contrast versus the ones that are to the right with the church in between. Even though acrylic dries very quickly, I try to take advantage of when the paint is still wet, particularly the sky. When you paint branches directly into the wet paint, you get a softer touch, and that is perfect for the branches that recede. The soft edges from the wet on wet application will create soft edges. When compared to the branches that are more closer to the viewing plane, it will make a big difference. Those branches will be more defined with sharper, harder edges, as well as more contrast and detail as well. This will help create an illusion of depth and distance for the tree. Something to keep in mind when painting the branches are the objects in your painting. In a way, you have to establish a sense of order on what you do first and what you do last, and also in between. For my situation, there was the church and the grass below, but I was also very mindful of all the branches, of what was in front and what was behind. So I painted accordingly. Which is why the sky was very important to paint first. That is also why I just made an impression of the roof and do not fully detail it until later on. I know most of the branches are going to be behind the church, but there will be a few in front, and I will save those for the very end. It's all about getting the correct order of layers. But that does not mean I'm not going to go back into the sky here and there. It just helps with the overall process if you have a game plan. Even though I find it very beneficial to do the branches first, it never hurts to start detailing some of the leaves, whether it's a few individual ones or clusters. But when doing them, be mindful of the distance that they are in the viewing plane, whether they're further into the back or closer to the front. With that in mind, use a softer touch for the receding leaves and the ones that are closer, sharper, and more defined. Just like the branches, sunlight will play an important role too. The ones that are more exposed to the sunlight will be brighter, and some clusters that are very dense will be darker because the sun won't be able to penetrate them. When you paint them, keep in mind that they're connected with branches, even if they're very tiny. My strategy was to do the bulk of the branches first, and then the leaves. But in some scenarios, I would do the leaves and the connected branches afterwards. But it's okay to have the illusion that there's some branches, especially for the very thin ones that are pushed more into the distance and recede into the sky. One of the things that stood out in the photo was definitely the bark. I worked on a tree on the previous painting, but it was a small section. But the thing I learned was to do the lights and darks first, more so in the middle tones. The idea is to establish the sunlight as well as the shadows. After that, it is lots and lots of line work. They might appear random, but I looked very carefully at the photo in order to get the correct colors. The base color I used for the trees was mostly alizarin crimson and some viridian. I made that mixture mostly for the darks. I used cadmium orange as well as cerulean blue for the warm and cool tones of the trees, and white as well to lighten them. But a key color that I used for the sunlight was cadmium lemon. I used it pretty frequently in the painting, mostly for the highlights of the grass and leaves, but also for the very bright spots on the bark and branches as well. On its own, it's kind of an ugly color, but it's pretty useful for some of the bright areas. One of the things that stood out in the photo was definitely the bark. I worked on a tree on the previous painting, but it was a small section. But the thing I learned was to do the lights and darks first, more so in the middle tones. The idea is to establish the sunlight as well as the shadows. After that, it is lots and lots of line work. They might appear random, but I looked very carefully at the photo in order to get the correct colors. The base color I used for the trees was mostly alizarin crimson and some viridian. I made that mixture mostly for the darks. I used cadmium orange as well as cerulean blue for the warm and cool tones of the trees, and white as well to lighten them. But a key color that I used for the sunlight was cadmium lemon. I used it pretty frequently in the painting, mostly for the highlights of the grass and leaves, but also for the very bright spots on the bark and branches as well. On its own, it's kind of an ugly color, but it's pretty useful for some of the bright areas. As for the texture itself, I didn't copy it line for line. That would be kinda insane, but the bark was directional. I tried to mimic the pattern, but I did try to copy some key features, such as a few bumps and later some moss that is grown on the side of the tree. But for the most part, most of the bark was inventive, but used the photo as a reference to mimic the pattern. But something I kept in mind was contrast. When it came to the bark that was in the shadow, it was more on a softer tone, but in the bright sunlight, it was very drastic. The lights and darks were more extreme. As for the areas where you transition from the sunlight to the shadow, you gotta do it in a way surgically. Some of the cools and darks should bleed into the lights, as well as some of the warm tones and lights bleed into the dark. You gotta keep in mind that the tree is also three-dimensional and not flat. So as you build the texture, the far edges of the tree's body and branches are definitely going to be a little more blurry. That's because the texture, as it wraps around the tree, recedes a bit from the viewing plane. Not by much. If you think of the tree as a cylinder, the part closest to you should be sharper and more detailed, and that is usually in the middle, unless the tree is really deformed. Not sure if that makes sense, but the idea is to make the bark on the sides more blurry. That will help establish a sense of volume with the tree, whether it's the trunk or the branches. A helpful tip is to try to use the same color as often as possible. And as you're doing the bark, remember, you're not copying the bark 100%, you're trying to mimic the pattern and colors that you see to the best of your ability. And if you're using acrylic, take advantage of the drying time. Keep building up the layers. After lots of repetition, you'll get the hang of it. And save the extreme lights and the extreme darks until the very end for the finishing touches. More on that later. Now on to some more branches and leaves. Just like the pattern of the bark, I'm not copying the leaves 100%, but I'm trying to establish a pattern of color that gives the illusion of lots of leaves. The photo was taken early spring, so the tree was not fully developed, and it was quite bare, to be honest. If anything, it was the branches that interested me the most. They have lots of twists and turns. Plus, they are full of lots of detail with the sunlight hitting them and the shadows that they cast as well. In a way, I paint it very carefully, building the branches one at a time, usually going from larger to smaller. For example, after establishing the big main branches, I would use them as a guide, kind of like a roadmap, to help me place the other branches in the correct spots. If I made a mistake, it wasn't the end of the world. I would make a mixture of the sky's color and use it in order to correct areas, whether it was to eliminate a branch or make some thinner. Again, that's the nice thing about acrylic. It dries quick and you can make constant corrections. Doing the tree branches does look very complicated, and I will be honest, there were times where I was lost. During those scenarios, I would stop and look very carefully and try to determine the placement of those branches, whether they were in the right spot or if a particular one was supposed to be in front or behind another branch. And then there was the sunlight and the shadows that they would cast. I mentioned earlier that the two trees on the far left are further from the viewing plane than the other two. Therefore, I tried to push them more into the distance. I did this by using more blue tones in the bark, the same one I used for the sky. Plus, the bark texture wasn't as intricate and the contrast was a lot lighter. That will help also bring the other two trees forward because they have a lot more detail. Little tricks like this help you create a 3D illusion on a 2D surface. As my teacher at Micah would say, you're not copying reality, you're creating an illusion of it. And by adding the sky blue to those trees, it's as if they're dissolving into the background. Something that attracted me to the photo was the way the tree branches were pointing to the church. During the painting process, I tried to emphasize this even more, and I had that in my mind as I painted the branches one by one. But I always kept going back to the reference photo in order to get the texture of the bark and to help me distinguish branches where they are placed, whether in front or behind. But the directional aspect was something that was very important, particularly for the composition. Even though the church was the main subject matter, the trees played a very important role, leading the viewer to it, especially the stonework, which I detailed brick by brick. My father helped build that section after all, so it was very important for me to be accurate and emphasize that section to the viewer. If there was something that was not that difficult, it was painting the leaves. It just required to be very patient and paint leaf by leaf in some situations. They definitely were not detailed. They were just an impression of leaves. But the key thing was to get the right colors at the right place. As mentioned earlier, I used cadmium lemon for the very extreme brights, mixed with a tad bit of cerulean blue, and I believe for the cooler tones I might have used viridian. There are some leaves that I used cadmium orange in order to neutralize the viridian. This gave some of the darks a warm tone. Though it does appear random the way I am placing the leaves, I did pay attention to the photo and tried to mimic some of the pattern, especially for a few stray leaves and for the sections where they're clustered together. As mentioned before, I do make sure it looks like they are connected to little branches. Going back to mimicking the pattern, I did the same thing for the bark of the branches. I did not copy the bark 100%, but I paid attention to the photo and replicated the pattern, as well as the direction of the bark, particularly the way it wraps itself around, and especially the lights and the darks. Some of the thinner branches were just represented with a mere line of bright cadmium lemon with some titanium white, and others were more simple with my alizarin crimson and viridian mix. And lastly, some of the branches were done while the paint was still wet, particularly the leaves. After applying the combination of greens, I would paint some branches directly into them, and that helped create some of the softer branches that were more distant or partially hidden among the leaves. The key not to lose your sanity while doing such a intricate web of branches is to keep in mind which branch is in front of the other and which ones are behind. And detailing the ones that are closer to the viewing plane, especially the thicker ones, will make all the difference of showing depth and distance within the branches. Speaking of depth and distance, this branch here is pretty close to the viewing plane, which is why the leaves are big and more detailed here. So instead of just painting a few dots and brushes of color, I tried to give some of these leaves some form. Another important thing to point out is I waited till I completed the bark, then I painted the leaves on top of it. I am not gonna lie, it is very repetitive to build the leaves and branches of the trees. But because acrylic does dry very quickly, it is actually not that bad. As mentioned before, I could use the color of the sky in order to correct sections. Most of the footage in this video is either 10 or 20 times the original speed. But make no mistake, I am painting very carefully, especially since I'm going for the finishing touches. I know a small mistake in an area where the paint is still wet can set me back, but when I do make mistakes, I just stay calm and wait for the paint to dry and correct them, and then continue building branches and leaves. To give the impression that there's sunlight, it requires more than just adding lights where the sunlight is visible. You have to keep in mind there are casted shadows as well, and a very important one that I tried to depict was on the side of the church. And also, even though they're not too detailed, I created the impression of trees on the windows as well. All this in a way is necessary to ground them in your painting and make them look like they actually belong there. Speaking of making things look like they belong there, not all the branches are connected to the tree. Some have fallen, such as this one here, and since it's pretty close to the viewing plane, I painted the leaves more distinctively. As for the branches that the leaves are connected to, just like the ones on the trees, I paid attention to the lights and darks in order to form them. And one more thing that I want to point out is that I waited to finish that section of the church before I started to paint that fallen branch. It is, in a way, in front of it. And though it's not visible in this video, the paint application is definitely thicker too. The physical texture of the leaves being in front of the church will help make it appear closer to the viewer and help with the illusion of depth and distance. Towards the end, I looked at my painting from a distance and I felt that the bark on the two trees that were closest was not popping out enough. So I go back into them, but this time I use a lighter light, which is titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange. I'm not trying to reinvent the bark, I'm just going back into it and adding brighter lights to the highlights that I already painted. Just like the leaves on the fallen branch, the paint application is definitely thicker. That is because physical texture in the right spots stand out more when actual physical light is present. I also go back into the darks to make them darker, but the paint application is not thick and it will remain thin. Dark things should recede, and if there's physical texture in those areas, they will stand out in a bad way. And to finish up painting the trees, I added some visible moss on the sides where it was visible in the photo, some on the top and some on the bottom. I applied the greens of the moss respectfully to the texture of the bark and paid attention to lights and darks as well. And lastly, there was that one branch that was in front of the roof tiles. I waited towards the end to paint that because it was in front of the church. Unlike the other branches that were behind, it made sense to paint this one last. There are also fallen leaves too, but I'm saving the process of making them for another video. Stay tuned.
If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it. And hopefully this video helped you get a better understanding on how to paint trees. They can get very complicated. Anyways, for more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Until next time, bye.